Okay, it's a bit strange having an audience on my back and in my front. If the microphone isn't loud enough, please warn me somehow. Yes, it's a great honour to give this talk. Actually, I first came to meetings of the Oncological Society here when I was a teenager, and that is over 40 years ago. And in the meantime, certainly the personnel have changed, with one exception, I think. But also the museum's changed dramatically. I mean, it must be doing something right to get this number of visitors. It never used to be like that 40 years ago. So I'm going to talk about this slug shown here, which nowadays we call Ambigolimax parvipenis. But it hasn't always been called that. In the first paper that, no, okay. Anybody know a way to move the slide on? Arrows are not working. Just thumbs it. Okay. The first work that described this species in any detail was Ben's and colleagues' book, excellent book on the slugs of Britain and Ireland, published in 2014. And this is the double-page spread about this species, and you can see at that time it hadn't been recorded very much from Great Britain and Ireland. And the other thing to notice is that it appears under a different name, Ambigolimax nyctelius. And the first part of my talk, probably more than half of it, will explain why we've had to change the name, which probably annoyed some people. And the second half of my talk will go on and deal in more detail with this particular species and some new findings that we've made about it. So I'm hoping that this first part will be a good example of the sort of work that taxonomists do. It's all been written up, at least the first half of the talk has been written up in this article, which appeared a couple of years ago. It's still behind a paywall for another couple of years, but if anybody is interested in receiving a PDF, please just email me and I'll send you that line immediately. So the name nyctelius came from a paper published by the French malacologist Bourguignat. In 1861, he had a reputation, or has a reputation, for unnecessarily splitting species and describing many new names that were unnecessary, but that's probably not the issue here. This article was about the slugs of Algeria, and this is his description of the species. In fact, he referred to the illustrations shown here, but they only appeared in a later work when he repeated the text. And in both the text and the illustration, he makes a point of the fact that this slug has the pneumostome, that's the breathing hole, in the front half of the mantle. And he points out that this is very unusual in slugs. In fact, we know that it's typical of the family Arionidae. And the only species in North Africa that has this character is a slug called Lytonoxia numidica, which is an Arionid slug. And it was this particular picture in a paper that made me realize that was the slug he was actually referring to. You can see that it does indeed have the pneumostome in the front half of the mantle. And another character that Bourguignat mentioned was that it had two dark lines on either side of the midline. So that also agrees with the description. The slug here also agrees with that aspect of the description. But you might be a bit puzzled by this identification, because you'll notice that Lytonoxia numidica was also described by Bourguignat, by the same guy, only 5 years later. Well, I think the reason for that is that the slug he described in 1866 was a big slug. It was at least 3 times the length of the one he described in 1861. And I think there might be some change of appearance with age in this species. But anyway, he didn't make the connection between the two. The other thing that emphasizes that it's probably a juvenile that he illustrated was the very enlarged, disproportionately large tentacles. That's typical of juvenile slugs. So we wanted to confirm this identification by looking at the type specimens, which are in the well, Bordenau's collection is in the museum in Geneva, and under that name there are 5 lots that come from various places in Algeria, and some of them correspond with the list of names that he gives in the species description. So they could potentially be syntypes or potential types. Nearly all these specimens in the collection are very juvenile. None of them have the pneumostome in the front half of the mantle, and they're clearly of a variety of species. But one adult specimen that we can clearly tie the locality of the sample with the locality in the paper is this example. It's been eaten at some stage during its life, and that's why it's a strange proportion. But if we dissect it, we find that it is undoubtedly a slug called Ambigolimax meditensis, which you might know from Italy, but it also occurs in North Africa. So if we were to treat this as a type specimen, we would have the problem that we would have to rename Ambigolimax nyctelius, which is the name that Ben and others have applied to the species we find now commonly in Britain. So that would be a really awkward situation. So rather than go down that road, we have designated as the leptotype the specimen that was illustrated by Bordenau in 1861, and this specimen is evidently now lost. And that means that we can transfer the name Nyctelia to Leuconoxia numidica. So what was called Leuconoxia numidica is now called Leuconoxia nyctelia. Okay, so we've kind of sorted out that species, but in the intervening 160 years, the name Nyctelius has been applied to a variety of other species, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. And the first person to do this was Simroth in 1885. So Simroth is a German malacologist, worked in Leipzig, and he was the first person to illustrate the genitalia of this species. Bordenau only described the external characters. And you can see from this illustration that the penis is a simple tubular structure with no appendage. And that's important because that's a character that other people remembered about Nyctelius. In his text, he didn't illustrate the external part, but external view, but in this text, he commented that the pneumostome was in the posterior part of the mantle. So that's in conflict with what Bordenau wrote, but he didn't comment on that conflict. And there's a reason for that. And then to that, we have to go back to some history. There's Simroth there in the middle. And the story is that Mario Lesona, who was an Italian, sent some specimens to Simroth that he claimed were Bordenau's Nyctelius. And Simroth looked through them, they were all juvenile, but he had another sample which looked the same, the juveniles looked the same, but that included an adult specimen. And so it's the adult specimen of this other sample that he illustrated as being Nyctelius. But he writes that he did not have access to the article written by Görlitz. So that's why he didn't pick up on this conflict in the position of the Pneumastone. So there's another figure here, which is Polonera. Polonera, he was an artist, a very good artist. That's a self-portrait by him. He's quite a famous artist. But he was the half-brother of Mario Lasona, so they worked together quite a lot. So he had access probably to the juveniles that Lasona had lent to Simrod, but he also was able to read the publications of Görlitz, and he published his work after Simrod, so no doubt he knew that publication too. And he was aware that there was this conflict, and he explained it as being an aberrant specimen that Görlitz had described, that it had been sort of half-eaten and regrown the Pneumastone in the wrong place. Never mind that Görlitz referred to several specimens, not just a single one. Anyway, he kind of smoothed over that. But he also confirmed various aspects of the anatomy that Simrod had made. One is that there were 3 intestinal loops, which is indicative of a limited slug rather than an Ambigolimax or a palmacellid. And he confirmed that there was no rectal cecum. The rectal cecum is a blind sac that comes off the gut and is very useful in family classification. And because it has no rectal cecum, he classified nyctelius in the genus Ambigolimax. Now, there is one Ambigolimax in Britain, quite rare in Britain. It's commoner on the continent. And it's not this species. Clearly, the genitalia don't look the same. And there are a couple of other species that Ambigolimax described, but none of them really fit the illustration of Simrod. But I certainly believe that Polonera and Simrod were correct in not finding a rectal cecum. They are very, very, very good anatomists. And also, we have actually found in various museums specimens from North Africa that also lack a rectal cecum. Unfortunately, they're juveniles. So yeah, we're not really in a position now at the moment, without more specimens, to say what it was that Simrod and Polonera actually observed. So that's dealt with that species, that unknown species. And the next event is the work of a young undergraduate who was writing his bachelor thesis on some slugs that had turned up in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. And they were sort of whitish slugs. And this is a wonderful piece of work. Fortunately, it's preserved in the museum in Edinburgh, so you can actually consult it. This is an illustration of the genitalia of the species. You can see that it has a rather long penis without an appendage. So I can point that out with a mouse. Down there. Yeah, this is Watterson as an old man or an elderly man. Of course, he was a young undergraduate when he did this work, and it's very impressive. But he was wise enough not to try and identify the species. He just called it Limax. And the person that actually put the name nyctelius to it was Quick in 1949. And he had access to Watterson's specimens, and he decided it was nyctelius, even though the Pneumastone was in the wrong place. He only cited Görlitz, but he might have been aware of Simrod's work, and of course it also doesn't fit with Simrod because it does have a rectal cecum. The rectal cecum is there, so clearly it's not the same species that Simrod worked with either. So one shouldn't be too quick to criticize Quick, because he actually really copied the identification, probably via Hugh Watson. So Watterson had sent some specimens to Hugh Watson for identification, and Hugh Watson at that stage was reticent to identify them and just said, well, they might be Ambigolimax valencianus. which is another species that occurs in Britain, more commonly now than then. And that's what Waterston wrote in his thesis. He didn't know what they were. But a little bit later, Connolly, working in South Africa, found what we now know is the same species as what Waterston had found. And he corresponded with Hugh Watson, and together they identified these as nyctelius. And so when Quick came to write his book about English slugs, he copied the identification that Connolly and Watson come up with. So this is the known distribution of Waterston species. Our belief is that it's native in North Africa. There have been specimens found in North Africa, but it's turned up elsewhere, not only in Scotland. There was some in Washington on the tree trunks of imported palm trees, imported from Algeria. We've mentioned South Africa. It also occurs in Australia and New Zealand, and on the island of Elba. Presumably all these sites are sites of introduction. Good old British Empire. But then it turned up, or was claimed to turn up, somewhere else. It was reported from Bulgaria by Grosu and Lupu in 1963. Now, Grosu is often quite a careless worker, but here it's quite hard to criticize him because indeed it has the same character, a long penis without an appendage in a Lemania-like, Ambigolimax-like slug. This has subsequently been found not only in Bulgaria, but right along the Carpathian chain of mountains, so into Slovakia and Poland. And it's mostly been found at high altitudes. So that seems a bit strange, but that it would be in such different habitats. But indeed, the identification was confirmed by the great Polish slug expert, Andrzej Wiktor. He had specimens both from Algeria and from the Carpathians, and he looked at the penis and he said, yep, they're the same, definitely. So everybody was happy with this identification. But it is worrisome because so this is the habitat where we find them in the Carpathians. This is in the High Tatra. They occur on these lichen-covered rocks, and come out at night and eat lichens. And when we keep them in captivity, they only eat lichens, whereas Ambigolimax species typically eat all sorts of things. Also, the appearance is rather different. This is the slugs from the Carpathian Mountains. They look a bit like our Lemania marginata. And this is the Waterston species, this one from Tasmania. And here are some dead specimens preserved in alcohol, but again, they look very much like an Ambigolimax valencianus. So, yeah, we got suspicious. We thought this can't be true. Despite us having very high opinion of Victor, we cut the penises open. And if you do that, it's clear that they are different species. The Waterston species has this double fold running along the penis with a kind of honeycomb structure in the middle of it, whereas the species from the Carpathians has a much more faint ribbing along most of the penis, but has this very prominent hood-like structure at the tip of the penis. So clearly they're two different species, and we felt that they needed to be named. So were there any old names that we had to use? There have been two suggestions for that. One was a slug described as Limax ligrandi from Tasmania. We couldn't, there's no illustration of in that work that described it, and we haven't been able to find any specimens in museums in Australia or Tasmania. And indeed, within a few years of its publication, other local conchologists in Australia were dismissing it as a synonym of the very common Dirotheres reticulatum. So we forget about that. But Ambigolimax curviliae was more of a challenge to dismiss. Described from Tunisia by Germain. Most of the specimens he collected were juveniles. Eventually, he found something that did have some genitalia, and it's illustrated on the right here. But we find it quite difficult to identify the slug from that picture. It certainly doesn't seem to have the long penis of Waterson's slug. And here are the type specimens that are still in the Paris Museum. Some of them have really been withered, probably by treatment in formalin, and there are others that are that probably were preserved in a different way with alcohol. They're very small. That staple is just 1¼ centimeters wide. We tried to dissect them. We got as far as showing that they did have a rectal cecum, so they're certainly not Simrod's slug. We didn't get much further. We tried to extract DNA and sequence that, but we generally failed. So yeah, we have to more or less ignore this species for the moment. Maybe somebody will collect some more specimens from the type locality in Tunisia one day. So we named Waterson's slug as Ambigolimax waterstoni. And these are the holotype, and it's actually one of the specimens that Waterson himself deposited in the museum in Edinburgh. It's in a little bit faded, but it is in a wonderful state of preservation, very easy to dissect. And you can see the very long penis. And the other species, the Carpathian species, well, we named it Lemania carpatica. And this was a mistake, I'm afraid. Earlier this year, Varna Gergely got in touch and said that he'd been reading some obscure Hungarian literature from the 19th century, and in it, Hasse described a species which he called Limax, or subspecies, a variety, Limax arborum var carpaticus. And subsequently, Limax arborum is the old name for Lemania marginatus. So subsequently, it has appeared in the literature as Lemania marginatus var carpaticus. And that means that what we described is a junior hominin. So therefore, it's an invalid name. Well, Hasse described the species just on external characters. He did describe where he got it from, which is basically lots of mountains in Slovakia. So it could potentially be 3 species that he was referring to. It could be marginata, it could be macroflagellatus, or it could be what we called Carpatica. And his collection was destroyed in the 1956 uprising in Hungary. So we sort of hatched a plan to rescue the situation. We thought we can go to Slovakia, we can find a slug from one of Hasse's localities that is in fact the same one that we described, the Lemania carpatica. And then we can designate that specimen as a neotype for Hasse's species. And then the name of what we called Lemania carpatica will remain Lemania carpatica, just with a different authority. Instead of Hutchinson et al., it will be Hasse 1874. And 2 weeks ago, we put our plan into action. This is at about 1,700 meters in the Slovak part of the High Tatra Mountains. You'll notice it's getting dark. The only way to find these slugs, if it's not pouring with rain, is to go out at night with a torch. We first of all, we had to get permission from the national park, which was, took a long time. And then you've got the hazard of sort of stumbling over boulder boulders in the dark looking for these little slugs. And there's an additional hazard, which is not usually something mycologists have to worry so much about. In fact, very sadly, a mushroom picker was killed by a bear the weekend we were there. So it's not a trivial consideration. But indeed, we found this slug at that precise point after another day's complete failure. But anyway, we eventually found this thing, which felt wonderful, particularly because it's exactly where, as I said, he found it. Well, he found it at 1,793 meters in this valley, and we think where we found it was about 1,760 meters. So close enough, yeah. The problem is we started dissecting them, and all the ones we've dissected so far are not the one species we want. They're macroflagellata. So we've still got some more to dissect, so we hope, but the worry would be that we have to give the name Carpatica to macroflagellata, which is going to be really, really confusing. So we're trying to find a way to avoid this. Yeah. Okay. That's those two species dealt with. And now we move on to species we started with, which Ben and others referred to in their 2014 book. That's Ambigolimax nyctelius. Also, but to be fair, they were aware that it didn't agree with the description that Quick had used when referring to water stony. They did point out that it had a much smaller penis. So that's the water stony. The scale bars are both 1 millimeter. So if you scale up the lower illustration, you'll see that the penis of water stony really is a lot bigger than what had been called nyctelius. So you'll notice that the penis in the top case is actually shorter from the versicopulatrix. So clearly we think they're different species, and we went ahead and named it Ambigolimax parvipenis, and that is the type specimen and a paratype from Almondbury in Yorkshire, just because we happen to have a good collection of the species from there. This is an illustration of the genitalia of that species. And usually you're concerned to distinguish it from the genitalia of Ambigolimax valencianus, which also occurs quite commonly in Britain. And the distinguishing character is this penial appendage here, which is very prominent in valencianus and is absent in parvipenis. Occasionally you get a little bump, which might confuse you, but yeah, there's a categorical difference there. Sometimes the penile appendage of valencianus is inverted into the penis, and then you might not spot it. That may be a reason to slit the penis open, but usually you don't need to do that because the penis of parvipenis is much shorter. So you can see it's about half the length of the versicopulatrix, whereas in valencianus, the penis is almost as long as the versicopulatrix. Parvipenis means short penis. I did want to call it Roussening, actually, but Ben wouldn't have any of it because he didn't want to be sent specimens and then have to reply that it's his slug. A very modest fellow. Okay. You do have to dissect these slugs to identify them. They're very variable. This is all examples of Ambigolimax parvipenis. Typically, these, you can just say, you see these two parallel lines on the mantle are sort of a big clue, but they're often very faint, and there can be lots of other lines and sort of blotches and things. So, and yeah, so quite a variable species, can also be yellowish rather than brown. And Ambigolimax valencianus has a similar range of variability in its coloration. These two slugs were actually found under the same stone. So yeah, to know what you've got to dissect them, and you've probably got to dissect more than one if you think there's a possibility of there being both species present. Valencianus started expanding a bit earlier in Britain than parvipenis, but parvipenis has kind of taken over and accelerated away. In our paper, we actually suggested there was a further difference in the length of the rectal cecum between the species. We now think that that's probably not a very reliable character. It might be indicative, but we found enough exceptions not to trust that. So the problem is you do have to have an adult to identify it, either that or you sequence the slug. Yeah, and the problem is that they can actually be quite large before they develop genitalia that are identifiable. We don't know a lot about the life history. These are some eggs. They typically lay a clutch of between about 14 and 40 eggs, and they will do that repeatedly. These are the hatchlings. You'll notice that in this one there's a stripe down the middle of the mantle, and then this there's no stripe down the middle of the mantle. So even the hatchlings are very variable in appearance. We can keep them very easily in the lab. They have a generation time of about, if we keep them at about 12 degrees centigrade, of 8 to 12 months, of which about a month is in the egg stage. So very similar to our experience of rearing Ambigolimax valencianus in the lab. Presumably both species are normally annual when they're outdoors. There's a lot more information available about valencianus, particularly from work in Japan, where it's become a common introduction. So they found at higher temperatures, it will actually mature in half a year. So maybe that's what's happening in North Africa. We don't know, but of course, there's dry seasons in North Africa might be important. But they also observed that it can withstand temperatures as low as -8 degrees centigrade. And other work on valencianus has shown that it's very happy to self. It will produce as many eggs when it's kept in isolation as when it's kept with a partner. But we also know from population studies in the wild that usually it outcrosses. Usually the offspring have different parents rather than offspring of a single individual. So the first evidence of parvipenis at all really was the David and Geraldine Holyoake noticed that they had what they thought were hemiphallic valencianus in their garden in Cornwall back in 1999, and various other people, including ourselves, found it in Devon in 2000. So that's really the first clear evidence of the species being there. But there are records of nyctelius from Ian Colleen's work in Suffolk in 1987, but I don't think anybody's ever traced what that species might have been. And as we heard in the last talk, it's now an extremely widespread species in British gardens. Ambigolimax valencianus is very widespread all over the world and has been for many decades. But so far, we have not got so many records of parvipenis. Because in Ireland, France, Spain and Portugal mainland, the Chafarinas Islands are just off the coast of Morocco, the Canaries. So, this makes us suspect that this species and probably all Ambigolimax species actually come from North Africa originally. But it's also turned up recently in Hungary and Greece. Was at the European Malacological Conference in Crete a few weeks ago, and it's turned up at a second site in Greece. So it's probably much more widespread than we currently know. It's also been known in California since 2005, and we found it in the garden center in Arizona about 2020. So yeah, it's probably much more widespread than people are aware. I'm not going to explain this in very much detail, but we sequenced a lot of the barcoding gene in this species. There's a gene network shown below, but the important aspect of reading the map is that symbols that are the same color are potentially different haplotypes that could have diverged after introduction into Britain or wherever. But ones that are different colors are certainly independent introductions from the area of origin. So you can see that there have been multiple introductions of different individuals. They could have all been introduced at the same time, but the genetic diversity is surprisingly high. We've no evidence at all that this diversity in the mitochondria corresponds to different species or subspecies. But you can still see evidence of the fossils of where they were kind of initially introduced. So, for instance, there's a cluster of blue points here in this corner of southeast England. There aren't any of the dark blue in the north of England, to our knowledge. And similarly, this green haplotype has been introduced to California, but there aren't any examples of this in Europe. So there must have been some independent introductions probably occurring from, we think, North Africa. Okay, so the rest of my talk is going to be about mating behavior. So sex videos. And here is mating of parvipenis. As is typical with many slugs, one slug follows the other, and eventually the leader doubles back and they start nibbling each other's flanks. And in this species, it all then happens reasonably quickly. They rear up and they will start to evert a part of their penis. That will start to appear. Appearing here. And when these two penises touch, it all happens very quickly. That's sperm exchange. So it's like the cloacal kiss that you get in birds, it's brief. And then afterwards, they sort of nibble each other for a while, and that's curious. Why should they be doing that? I mean, they've done the job. They've transferred the sperm. Yeah, and they can actually, they do this for some minutes, and they can actually rear up into a tower like that, which is actually a difference between this species and Valencianus. And even more sort of unusual is that they're very willing to mate again quite quickly. Many instances of them mating again within an hour, but sometimes even within half an hour. And that's rather unusual, well, totally unknown actually in any other slugs that we've worked with, that they're so willing to remate so quickly. Just to explain what happens when this mating happens, but the times down there are relative to the kind of explosive phase of the copulation. So they just touch here, and within a tenth of a second of touching, the penises will evert like that. And if you look at your right hand, what's happening is that the thumb is pushing the sperm into the partner's palm formed by your fingers. Yeah, so it's like that. You can practice this with your neighbour. you've only got one right hand, so you can't practice with yourself. You have to practice with your neighbour. So there we are. The thumb has deposited the sperm now, and then it just. Whoops, sorry. I don't want to do that. It just slides off, leaving the sperm behind, the white ejaculate behind. So I'll just go back, 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 and then toward again. Sliding off. And here's another one. Again, that's the actual point of sperm exchange. And then they slide away again. And we can get more information about this by freezing the slugs with a ice spray just at the moment in copula. And this is a specimen just before the explosion. And you can see that there is this, it looks just like a rounded knob when you look at them in the videos. But when you sort of kill them like this and you cleared away the mucus, you can see that there's a little pocket here. It seems to be some little structures there which maybe help the sperm to stick. This is where the sperm will be deposited. And this is the bit, this slit here connects to the vas deferens, and this is the part that will actually deposit the sperm. It's like a punch deposits the sperm. Here's actually during that punch, I was very lucky just to catch that. You can see a drop of sperm at the end here. So that's the kind of eversion, full eversion. And afterwards, you can see the sperm held in this pocket. And, you can just pull the sperm out of it, just show you how it sits in the pocket. And here's another one that we've killed just before the explosion, but then we've dissected this one. And you can see here is the vas deferens with a little bit of ejaculate in it, but most of the ejaculate is held in the proximal part of the penis. And if we look at the penis in its retracted state, the vas deferens comes in here, and this bit here is the bit that does the punching of the sperm onto the partner, and this is the bit, this boat-like structure is the bit that receives the sperm. Curiously, if we cut the penis open here and here and here, you can see there's quite a lot of variation within the penis in the structure of these parts. So that's curious. Somebody could do some more research on that. You might wonder whether parvipenis can mate with Valencianus. And here is the answer. The dark slug is parvipenis and the light slug is Valenciana. They're very willingly caught with each other. No problem getting them to do that. And they're obviously both getting quite excited now. Valenciana here is beginning to evert its penis. Rather than having a knob that everts, it's a kind of trumpet-like structure in Valencianus. And the parvipenis is a bit behindhand. And this trumpet-like structure, when it touches the parvipenis, it will actually evert. Yeah, that's the Valenciana, and you can see the sperm's been dropped. Now the parvipenis has everted its penis, and that's sperm from the parvipenis. But because they don't do it at the same time, the sperm is lost. It's not transferred from penis to penis. So this happens consistently. Usually the parvipenis doesn't evert at all, but it's typical that the Valenciana does evert, but just deposits the sperm on the body of the parvipenis and it's lost. Okay. And now, as a last component of the talk, perhaps you'd be interested in seeing some matings of the other long penis nyctelius. You've seen the short penis nyctelius, parvipenis. What about the long penis forms? And let's start with the Carpatica. There's two views of the same mating. Remember, they have a very long penis. What are they going to do with it? Well, they invert a bit of it, sort of stalk. And then they wrap around it. I was a bit unprepared for this, so it's gone off. You know, I had to move the camera. But yeah, you can actually see the sperm, little white sperm ejaculate, moving up the. Here it goes, moving up the penis, and it's swapped at the tip of the penis between partners using that hood that you saw in the dissection, and then they wind it back in again. You see the ejaculate successfully exchanged. Sorry, the quality is not great because I was using an old type of camera. We've got, got much better videos of specimens from Bulgaria. The earlier illustration, the earlier video was slugs from the High Tatra. And interesting, the Bulgarian slugs have shorter penises. So that's the sort of maximum extent of the Bulgarian ones on the left and the High Tatra ones on the right. They take longer to evert and they evert further. So you do wonder whether they could successfully mate with each other. You wonder whether there's a decline of penis length across Europe or whether there are two distinct varieties. There's no clear genetic difference that we found so far. And you wonder why the penises are so long. And you might presume that there's some selective advantage in having a slightly longer penis than your partner, and that's generated a selective arms race that's favoured the evolution of longer and longer penises. And what you do with a longer penis? Well, the obvious thing you can do with it is to form a double helix like this. And it's not the only example, it's exactly what Limax does. Some Limax penises are 81 centimeters long. But even most Limax species have fairly long penises, and they do form this double helix. And we've got another example in Durosaurus species as well, where they form a double helix. So we've got one more species to look at, which is water stony. We would predict, based on this, that they also have formed a double helix with their penises. So to test this hypothesis, we had to get hold of some water stony, and it proved surprisingly difficult. But the population in Edinburgh has gone extinct as far as we're aware. It's not easy to access material from Algeria. We have tried to obtain dead material from South Africa and Australia, and it's usually what's being sent to us is Valenciana, not water stony. It seems that Valenciana is now taking over from water stony in South Africa and Australia. But eventually, this chap came to our rescue, Kevin Bond. Seems an interesting character. He's chess champion of Tasmania. If you look at him on the web, mostly you hear about his career as working on voting decisions and theory of elections. But he's a Renaissance man. He knows how to dissect a slug. He very kindly found us a living population of water stony that he confirmed by dissection, and then he passed that few slugs onto a colleague of ours that was in Tasmania on holiday, and we eventually ended up with 4 live specimens, and we got them to mate. So this is a world premiere of mating in water stony. Are they going to form a double helix? Well, it's very curious what they're doing. They're reverting at the tip, but they seem at the same time to be retracting at the base. And we can actually look at that in a little bit more detail. So from the movements on the penis, you can see that it is everting at the tip and continues to evert at the tip. But the penis doesn't get any longer, so it must be retracting at the base to compensate. Now we've got a new generation of these slugs. So we can do some more experiments. We can freeze them at the right moment. But that's work in progress. Well, that's almost the end of my talk. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators. Heike Reiser is my wife and colleague, and she's done most of the dissections and much other aspects of the research we've talked about. And Bettina Schlitt is our long-term assistant who has done all the molecular work. So in this study, we've used molecular results to decide which genus these species belong to. But you'll notice that quite a lot of what we were doing is just old traditional taxonomy using anatomy and borrowing specimens, which is quite a lot of work from well, all over the world, really. So we've got to thank a lot of collectors, a lot of collections and their curators who have been helpful, and very many other people as well who've been helpful. It's interesting that actually it's some aspects of this sort of research has got much easier now that we've got online availability of the old literature. But borrowing specimens and accessing museums is perhaps getting a little bit more difficult nowadays than it was some time ago. And that's it. Yeah, thank you.
That was marvellous. Thank you. The bit at the end was worth coming to London for alone. That was great. I've got lots of questions, but I'm sure other people do as well. So let's see what we've got. Anyone?
Oh, Peter, I was just going to ask about the Mania maculator, which seems to have sort of taken over from Valentianus.
Oh, that's Limacus. So it's a different genus.
Okay.
Limacus maculata. Yes, that seems to have taken over from Flavus. Is that what you're saying?
Sorry, Flavus.
Yeah. Yes. Well, you showed that there would seem to be hybridization between these two, based on mitochondrial DNA. And it's quite believable. It's interesting. It doesn't seem to be just that maculatus has gone to places where Flavus never occurred before. When I was a student, Limacus was quite rare in the south of England, and it was always Flavus in those days. And so I wondered when maculatus got a lot more common, whether it was just spreading to places where Flavus never occurred before. But actually, I revisited 4 or 5 spots where, when I was an undergraduate or a student, I had found Flavus. And what I collected 3 or 4 years ago was all maculatus. It really does seem to have replaced them. Yeah, and and of course that process probably happened in Ireland not earlier. Maculatus colonized 100 years ago. And it's also spreading in Germany as well. Maculatus.
So it's slightly off the
I was the first one to find maculatus in this country, which was named Hutchinson. And in Ireland, they were rather greenish and they were rather darker. And these days, of course, I've got it in my they cover the kitchen sink in my garden. But they get the impression there's some more. They're rather more yellow, and and I get the impression that that's coming from several different places.
Well, if it's hybridized with Flavus, then perhaps it's accumulated the coloration of Flavus.
In the days when I found it in Ireland, you would need to go to a wood with logs, and you turn over logs, and it wasn't actually in buildings. And when and when the Slugs Island was done, he obviously would have got, Stelpop would have got it from his garden, so that probably would have been Flavus. And Flavus was very much a domestic sort of slug, which was found in outdoor loos and Victorian walls and damp cellars and places like that. And Gilbert White found it in Selborne, which he called the cellar slug. So it seems to be the maculatus seems to be having a habitat change.
Yes, so the first time I found maculatus in Britain was actually in the 1990s in ancient woodland in Surrey under logs.
Hogsback.
Hmm?
Oh, the Hogsback, do you say no? Ancient woodland in Surrey.
In Surrey, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Is it what about about 2000 and so forth? They started coming to the London area.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, but as you say, now it's found in buildings.
And then I thought I'd have it in my garden.
So there's been a tendency to ID Ambigolimax based on the banding, and from what you're saying, that's not reliable anymore, which I totally agree with, by the way. But do you think it's possible to verify records if they've got good photos or videos of them mating, based on the videos that you showed?
Can I just ask, Robert's obviously having difficulty hearing, can we use the microphone? So that people can hear the questions?
Yes, but it would be an unsettling visual journey. Sorry.
I'll just finish my question. But so I was just asking about the fact that we used to verify records based on the external banding of what was nyctelius and valentianus. But I'm asking if John thinks it's possible to verify records if people provide videos of them mating, whether you can see enough of the penis to decide from that.
Yes, I can say that. You can very easily identify them by the mating, even if it isn't complete, actually. Yeah. The other thing worth saying about external characters is that they are useful if you've got a population and you want to know what they are. You would obviously not dissect all the same color. You would choose different banding patterns because it's quite likely that they might be. There's more likely that they will be different species than if you just choose one, because presumably these, they haven't completely. Well, different introductions are likely to have different colors. Yeah. So the banding pattern is helpful in deciding what to dissect.
I have a question, John. So I invented the English name Balkan 3-band slug for Ambigolimax nyctelius.
Yes.
Then, because there's the other species of Ambigolimax was called a 3-band garden slug in the USA and various other places. And it seemed to be from the Western Mediterranean. Now, all the sources I looked at seem to suggest that what we were all calling nyctelius up until that point was from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. I noticed you said there were records south to Albania, although that's now proven to be a different species. But that's why I called it Balkan 3-band garden slug. But it's obviously a terrible name. So what should we call it in English?
Well, I would suggest the name you should use in English is Ambigolimax parvipenis.
Some people aren't going to like that.
No. You could call it the small penis. That would also go down a treat. Yeah.
You have a specific suggestion, Victoria? Okay, thanks.
I've got a question. So, do you think other species of Ambigolimax might turn up in the UK?
Well, potentially, we don't know of any other species of Ambigolimax, but we suspect there may be very well may be more in North Africa. But that needs somebody to go and do some collecting at Christmas time in Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia. It doesn't sound too unpleasant. but the problem is it's getting permission to collect. And that's becoming increasingly difficult. But I suspect it would certainly be very interesting to do that, because at least we'd find out more about the native habitat and variation in the native populations of the Ambigolimax that have come over here. And maybe we would, as you say, we would be warned about the absence of other species that might invade subsequently.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, your comment at the end, John, about museum collections becoming more difficult to access and new collections being harder to make. Because I guess about 40 years ago, which was before my time, but that was when we got much better access to Eastern European colleagues and collections and things. So that must have been a big liberalization, but now we seem to have increasing difficulties sharing material, even within Western institutions.
Yeah, a lot of curators say they will not risk sending their specimens. There have been some horrible stories of Australian customs burning type specimens and things like this. Some curators do it unofficially, but the British Museum here, it's very easy to work with. Also Cardiff, it's been pretty helpful, but it's not the case with all collections. And it's, even if you travel to a museum to look at the specimens, it's more difficult to study them often when you're away from your own literature and comparative material. Yeah.
Any more questions? No? Any more questions from online? No? Okay, can we give our speaker another round of applause, please, for his excellent presentation?